Is the mic on? Hey. Thanks for coming. My name's Chad Robertson. I'm going to talk about strengthening your security program, analytics, intelligence, and DLP. I'm a senior threat researcher at Fidelis Cybersecurity Solutions. I'm on the TRT team, the threat research team. I've been in security for over 10 years. I've helped build incident response teams and security operations center, malware analysis capabilities, and forensics labs. My background is technical and more on the analysis side, so this will be a practical perspective. And I have a variety of certifications and published papers. So this is the agenda. We'll start talking about security events, just kind of a basic background, discuss indicators, what separates, what distinguishes an event from an alert, in my eyes, historical analytics and how that can play a role in an organization, intelligence, so receiving intelligence feeds, and then acting upon them, what you can do with them, DLP, which helps detect loss of key intellectual property and unusual activity. And then some objectives at the end. So how we can sort of bring all these things together to maybe bolster security postures and still sort of focus on the analytics piece to be able to look backwards. So instead of just looking forwards, we can look backwards historically to detect compromise. And that's something else, I guess, is there's a lot of talk about the assumed breach. You assumed your breach, and that way you can detect based on that assumption. And we'll sort of take it from that perspective as well. And this is a practical perspective, or a practical approach. So there will be examples of some malicious activity, how those align to different indicators, and then how we might detect those scenarios. So, from the full life cycle of the breach, somebody exploit kit, something like that. And we'll go into that a little bit later. So, to frame the whole conversation, security event monitoring infrastructure and security events devices produce events. We produce a lot of events. So you have all these events. We have lots of products out there that correlate these events into alerts, right? And then so this is just a screenshot of a PCAP that shows lots of different indicators. My pointer doesn't work. So you have events. How can you take those events? Or we work to, and we have technologies in place to sort of take those events and distill those down into alerts, and then to make them actionable, and then to, of course, action them. And this is just a PCAP that has like a URL, and we'll talk about this. We'll dig into this a little bit deeper on the next slides. But so examples of indicators, and we'll talk about those in a minute too. A URL, user agent string. There's some binary or some decimal, some number context or number content there, and then there's a server response. So all of those things are indicators, and you can have a way I like to look at it is you have atomic indicators, computed indicators, and behavioral indicators, and others have framed it this way as well. So the atomic indicator would be an individual indicator, IP, domain, user agent string. Computed indicator, MD5. MD5 is message digest algorithm, so it's everybody knows sort of what an MD5 is, 32-digit hexadecimal number. And so you have computed, you have atomic, and we have behavioral. And so again, sort of in the exploit kit scenario, you have an exploit kit. It compromises. It tries to load a flash file that takes advantage of CVE, in this case 2014 8440, and then that results in a dropper, and then that results in ransomware. Ransomware being something that's going to maybe encrypt a bunch of critical information on your on a drive, or if the drive is connected to a SAN, maybe the whole SAN or an AS, and that's bad news. So that's a behavioral, and so what we can do is if we sort of take a heuristic approach to this, we're really good at sort of detecting the atomics, and we get that a lot from intelligence sources. and computed as well. But the behavioral is sort of looking at a series of those, or a scenario of individual indicators that can be aligned to form a behavior. And then the .NET example is just a .NET assembly that happens to have custom packing and static strings and a binary that might form a behavior as well. So things we do with this today, we put all that in a SIM or log storage. SIM typically has built-in correlation intelligence, or we can bolster that with the SOC team or analysts. The log store designed to efficiently store logs, not necessarily be a SIM or correlate events, but they may have bolt-on SIM capabilities. So what do we do with this? We get all this information from all these different sources. We have these events, because they're still events, and then the SIM may have intelligence built in to turn them into alerts. So it's important to know our networks best. Who knows our networks best? We do. So use that knowledge to tune rule sets. Noise alerts are detrimental to operations, and so we have all this data. We have these indicators, and we use these technologies to sort of accrue them. So now there we go. So let's talk about analytics, and that's a really common sort of really common topic. And so historical analytics. Why is a historical view important? So this is maybe what we see today. So this is Wireshark, and this is a PCAP. The PCAP source is down there. So each one of these things are indicators, and we have lots and lots of tools out there that can detect this stuff. We have IPs. That's an individual. It's an atomic indicator. We have a URL. There's an iframe. So this is an exploit kit. In this case, it's an exploit kit. There's a URL, and so historical analytics is being able to look at this in the past and to be able to do something about it or detect it having happened previously. So we do this sort of currently, but how might this look historically? Just a real quick example on this. So say if you have 10 systems in an organization, and those systems get compromised by something. We'll stick with the exploit kit example. And so that happens. 10 systems compromised. 5 days pass. We don't know about it. Those systems are compromised and been compromised for 5 days. After 5 days, the analysts get some sort of information intel to be able to detect it. They find from then on they can see future compromise, but not necessarily historical compromise. And so that's where the historical analytics piece comes into play, especially if C2 changes. So if you have an exploit kit that does some sort of behavior, and we'll go through an example in just a minute, and that behavior, the initial exploit is one behavior, and then the subsequent C2, and then perhaps the later action or the different additional loader, and then the downloader or then payload does different things. If you're not if that initial C2 or that initial traffic that the analyst has an indicator for to detect doesn't persist, then you can't necessarily see that ongoing traffic. And so that's where the historical view comes in. And so here's an example of that. So this is so looking at the same PCAP. The first thing is a frame, and so this is a website, and so that frame loads a separate website. And then the next step is a iframe, and so this iframe tries to download. I think it's Fiesta exploit kit, and so there's some indicators. We have a domain, a / URL pattern, and then I think it's 34 hex characters long URI. And then next would be the system. The system is trying to be infected. The malware is trying to infect. The exploit kit is trying to infect. We'll send a shockwave flash file. There's a name down there. Next is a Silverlight file, and then finally a jar file. So one of those hopefully will be successful, at least in the malware, malicious author's eyes, in the exploit kit, and not in our case. But so one of those will compromise the box, or if one of those compromises the box, then there'll be additional C2. And so this traffic is going out and getting a downloader, which then, if you look on VirusTotal, is this executable. And then later, next is the actual payload. And in this case, the payload is Astra. And we can find out a little bit of information about that on the web. And so these individual pieces come together, form a heuristic, right? And so heuristic is ability to sort of take these individual pieces and sort of put them together into a dynamic, or sort of, well, a behavioral rule or behavioral logic that can be applied to a series of events or to data to detect anomalies. That's an example. So here's another example of historical analytics. And this is just so a persistent actor gains foothold on an enterprise. The actor begins scanning for other internal resources. And maybe days pass, right? So first thing happens, something, whatever way they get in, the access occurs. There's an internal scanning or looking for things, and then maybe a few days later, there's additional activity, and that new activity looks for internal resources or additional internal resources, or tries to pivot and move laterally. Actor identifies credential servers and attempts to brute force login. Actor finds legacy systems with local accounts. And so historical analytics, we can detect any one of these things, hopefully. Or we have all these, we have technologies that try to detect these things. And so you have these at your ingress and egress points, or the perimeter points, and then internally on the network. And the historical analytics piece comes in. So if we don't detect these, right, the individual events, that we can start to look at them heuristically and start to see this machine, the source of this, should never be scanning. Say it scans a subnet, so a Class C subnet, 256 hosts, or fewer than that because you can't use the top and the bottom. But anyway, you scan 254 hosts. That source server should never. Maybe they should. Maybe that server is one that does internal scanning, and that's great. And then you can whitelist that. But if you can start to detect that traffic, and then start to align it to some of these other indicators, these individual indicators, and you can form behaviors, and you can start to look at those behaviors over time, historically. So this happens, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and you find out about it 15 days later. If you have a historical record of these things having happened, then you can search on them the day you find out, present day, and detect back 15 days ago when it happened. So in summary, historical analytics detect singular events when possible, detect event scenarios when singular events go undetected, and maintain historic view of events. Next is intelligence. So intelligence, there's a variety of intelligence sources. We get lots and lots of intelligence, and there's intelligence from a variety of, there's intelligence from forums, there's open source intelligence, email lists, lots and lots of malware reports, social networking, Twitter, those kind of things are constantly sort of sending new information. ISACs, InfraGard, US CERT, all these places are, and so what do we do with all this stuff? One of the things that is really helpful, open source. So if you have these open source intelligence sources, I like a tool called Yara. There's a tool called Yara that can be used. So if you get an IP address and you get or an MD5 or an indicator, whatever piece of data you have, you can start using. You could use Yara, which is it's an open source tool. You might look it up. I don't have a website link up there, but it's pretty good. So anyway, this is intelligence sources, right? And so you have all these external intelligence streams, and then you have internal intelligence streams. So the incident response team is responding to incidents, and as they do, there's an intelligence being built with that. And so that intelligence can be funneled back into the team, or back into your intelligence program, into the Security Operations Center, and as well as the analysis reports that are the output of those capabilities. So build intelligence internally, consume intelligence from external sources, and update and maintain intelligence program. Consume intelligence from external sources, we talked about that a little bit. The researcher posts, third-party providers, and public analysis reports are all places that this stuff can come from, and that we can use to bolster defenses. So next is the DLP portion. And so this is sort of framing it all, and then we'll talk about some objectives at the end. DLP, designed to monitor and detect data loss, things like confidential documents, social security numbers, credit card numbers, loss of key intellectual property, and unusual activity. And we'll have an example of a DLP scenario here in just a minute. Egress leakage, mistakes or intentional, and unauthorized internal activity, network shares, and files. And so an example of that might be a user copies a large number of files from a network share to their local computer. A user, and this goes back to the analytics piece as well. User creates a password-protected zip file of those files. User emails the zip file to their personal email account. So it's important to detect each one of these, and a DLP solution is trying to do so. And then also an analytics piece would maybe be able to try to detect the series. Consider these types of scenarios and how to detect them. And so doing so might be at a host-based system monitoring or network DLP solutions, or a combination of both of those, because you might be able to we might be able to detect the file network share from a network DLP, and then have a host and have those sort of correlated together. All right, so next is objectives. Okay, so the objectives. What do we do with all this stuff? Know your network, know our networks, know the network better than the adversary. And so I think it's really important to understand what we consider our most valuable resource to be, and then try to spin it around and take it from the adversary's approach. So if you have an attacker, what might they be looking for? Because they don't always necessarily align. Isolate what can be isolated. So, and this is, I think, key. Maybe, yeah, this is key too. So if you have something critical, a SQL server. So you have your SQL servers on one network. Don't have those on. We don't want to have those on the same network as the VPN login or the user resources, workstations. If you can isolate it and segment it, segment critical resources from user networks. If we can segment those resources, then we can monitor them. And so that's really the key. Key to all this is to monitor, right? If we're monitoring and if we accrue the data, today we can do something about it when we know about it. If we don't know about it, we're still accruing it. And then historically, when we do know about it, we can go back and see, okay, we can see that these new infections have occurred from this point on, but we can also see that these historic infections or this historic activity occurred, and do something about that as well, remediate that as well. Segment critical resources from user networks. Yeah. Limit activity internally. So the SQL DBA should be the only one that's traversing, going to the SQL farm. The VPN or the VPN subnet network, VPN resources If the SQL person is going to come in on VPN, then they may as well. But if we can limit the activity across those different segments, and then monitor it over time, then we can start to detect these things. Identify and remove antiquated systems, and that's so shadow IT is a sort of common way of describing that. So the wiki says wiki calls shadow IT as a term often used to describe IT systems and IT solutions. Wikipedia built and used inside organizations without explicit organizational approval, and so that's some sort of a system, organic system that was built to accomplish one specific task or a set of users that had a task in mind, and so they developed, they pushed out a system to perform that task. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you're doing a network map. Identify organically grown systems, do something about them, and then identify and remove antiquated systems. Antiquated systems, if you have an NT box, isolate that. If it has to be there and it runs a system that can't be patched or can't be updated and can't install on any other operating system. And then annual review, is good, but if we can do more often than that, that would be great. Sometimes it's hard to even do the annual, but so annual review, review more often if possible. What else? Know thy network. Scan for new hosts. People reviewing the output should not be those who are deploying the new systems. So the folks that are looking at the output of the scans shouldn't be the one that are putting, because we need to be able to detect that stuff. Scan ongoing, maintain analytics focus. Monitor historical data for abnormal occurrences based on today's intel. And so that goes back to our information, our sort of scenario. If we use the data we know now, today, historically, we can be better off. Look for suspicious event sequences or rates. So sequences and rates is a really sort of interesting perspective. So if you're looking at analytics overall, you can look at event sequences, which is sort of what we talked about earlier. You have the exploit kit, you have a frame, iframe, series of 3 executable files, Silverlight, jar, and Flash. And then C2 that has binary data. And then you have these, so you have a sequence. And so if you can do that, look at those sequences with an analytic engine, then that's great. And then also, so there'd be rates. And so that's really the two sides of the coin, right? So you have the sequence perspective of analytics, and then you have the rate perspective, which would be more of the internal system scanning a bunch of systems to try to find additional, internal resources, identify internal resources. And so if you have a rate of scanning, or you have, if we identify a user that's trying to fail login 10 times, in a small duration of time, then that can be considered a rate. And I think it's important to sort of think of that as a heuristic instead of a rule, because we have a lot of rules for detections, but when you start to look at those behaviors or those heuristics, I guess it's still a logical pattern, right? So you're still defining it into a rule. It can't be but still you're sort of broadening that perspective to be able to detect more heuristically instead of signature or rule based with that analytics focus. And then maintain an instant response capability. Build it once, refine it constantly. Reincorporate process output as process input. Make sure that the lessons learned step of the instant response capability is practiced, and that information goes back into the intelligence capability that is maintained, and then test the plan. Malware analysis and forensics. If not maintained in-house, build relationships with third-party providers. It's important to have, that can be just as simple as being in InfraGard and having conversations with those folks to be able to know who you can call, who your local folks are that you can call in case, and they can help you then find what you need if there's ever a situation when that comes to pass. Those resources are necessary. intelligence feeds, consume and or create depending on goals. So intelligence, I think, can be considered from two perspectives. You can be a consumer of intelligence or creator of intelligence. And so depending on goals and the enterprise and enterprise resources and goals, you can do either one of those. And so if you're going to consume, then consider the consumption sources. You're going to do automated consumption from a third-party provider. Are you going to do, or are you going to be a creator of, and creator can go all the way down to a one-person sort of incident response capability. If you have one person, and they're creating intelligence by going out and doing research and finding indicators and then writing custom signatures, there's a whole spectrum of possibilities with intelligence. Develop training plan, encourage outreach, and employees value what their bosses and or organizations value, so make sure perceived value trickles down. Excuse me. Training plan. Training is it's important. We all know this. And then making sure that the perspective is the paradigm, I guess, is that training that the security is valued overall by the organization, because individual users will then be more valuing. What else? Monitor internally egress and ingress points. The onion and egg security model rhetoric is I think it's difficult to apply to today's sort of security landscape. Onion being layer, and I think it's a great model to define a simplistic perspective of security. But I think that there's you can layer your defense and then also look internally. So you build the layers on. We can build the layers on. We can set up all these sort of in depth. But then inside, we can also go laterally and detect movement inside of the enterprise, behaviors, patterns based on the analytics, and those kind of things as well. Avoid organic growth. Not always bad, but can be difficult to maintain. Cut down false positives whenever possible. Thousands of alerts, it's hard to pay attention to. Maintain a training budget specifically for security. That's it is what it is. Support team pet projects and innovations. So the people that are the eyes on the screen, especially in an analyst role, can become it's sort of a difficult kind of thing to stare at a screen all the time and look at security events. So doing these kind of things can really sort of support those initiatives. Avoid stagnation, and there's always more that can be done. Refine, re-examine, reevaluate, and ask for help. So going back to the layered approach, we have layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. Once we get to the point that there's always a point to step back and sort of look at the whole landscape, look at the technologies, look at the layering, look at the way they all fit together, and say how can we let's re-examine our assets. Let's ask new questions and see what critical components are in our system. See what's in our enterprise, what's changed, and then see how we can reapply our security models. And then monitor. Internal traffic, ingress traffic, laterally, historically, intelligence streams, SIM output, and incident response output. So capture as much data as possible. Capture internal data, capture data at the egress/ingress points, and then maintain the analytical perspective, the historic perspective. If not today, then sort of figure out how we can incorporate that later. Constantly monitoring intelligence streams and funnel that back into capability. And I think that's it. I talked really fast, so I went through that really fast. But Any questions? I'd be happy to, we can have a dialogue if we want. Be happy to, we can spend some more time on the topic. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't have the answer, but I think you're right. Sticks and taxi and crits, those are all relatively new, but really great intelligence sharing frameworks. I think I guess it depends on the organization. I don't know that I think that it depends on the organization. I think that some of them wire up differently to third-party providers, so maybe it would be, you could consider where your intelligence streams are coming from. So if you're doing, if whichever one is supporting the most intelligence streams, that might be something to consider. I know some might be more supporting than others. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.